Welcome, friends. Come on in and make yourself comfortable. Whether you're curled beneath a blanket resting your head against a familiar pillow, or sitting quietly while the last of the evening light fades, I am glad you are here. Let the noises of the day grow distant and let the room become still. Outside, perhaps the night has settled over rooftops and roads and the world has begun to slow. So before we begin, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy these journeys into the past. And let me know where you're listening from tonight and what time it is where you are. Now allow the hour to soften. Imagine the glow of a small lamp, the quiet weight of blankets, and the comfort of knowing that nothing more is required of you tonight. Tonight we are stepping back into the medieval world, into a landscape of stone keeps, damp fields, monastery bells and villages gathered beneath distant authority. It is a world where news travelled slowly and where a few lines written in a royal chamber might eventually reach a farmer standing ankle-deep in mud beside a winter field. The story begins not with a tax collector at the door, but with a need. Inside a castle hall long after the evening meal had been cleared from wooden trenches, clerks might still be working by the wavering light of beeswax candles. Rushes covered the floor, though they did little to hide the chill rising through the stone. A lord's household consumed grain wine, salt firewood, cloth, horseshoes, lamp oil and labour. A king's household consumed far more. Messengers needed mounts, soldiers needed wages, and castle roofs required repair. Weddings, embassies, and wars demanded quantities no ruler could simply find within a treasure chest. Medieval rulers were not surrounded by modern systems of regular income. Their wealth came from estates, rents, tolls, fines, feudal obligations, and occasional extraordinary levies. Yet even now, historians continue to debate how consistently these systems worked from one realm to another. Some kings possessed rich lands and trained officials. Others ruled where authority faded beyond the nearest fortress wall. A royal command might sound absolute in a candlelit chamber, but on a muddy road 3 days away it could become little more than folded parchment guarded by 2 tired horsemen. When a ruler decided that more money was required, the demand moved outward in stages. A sealed order might be sent to sheriffs, castellans, bishops, abbots, or great landholders. They summoned local officers, manor stewards, reeves, and clerks. Its language invoked the king's peace, the defence of the realm, or an urgent campaign. The seal mattered greatly. Many could not read, but they understood the wax emblem. A broken seal might cast doubt on the message. From castles and abbeys, the order continued down the roads. It passed roadside shrines where travellers left scraps of cloth or coins for protection. It crossed bridges slick with rain and entered market towns through gates where tolls were already collected on wool grain, fish and livestock. Mounted messengers might wear fur-lined cloaks while local men carried the news on foot and slept in barns before continuing at dawn. The first sign in a village might be the ringing of a bell. Church bells marked hours, warned of fire, announced death, summoned courts, and gathered neighbours for official business. On a grey morning, as mist rested low over the fields, villagers might leave their ploughs, ovens, looms, and animal pens, and make their way toward the churchyard or manor hall. Mud clung to wooden shoes. Wool cloaks smelled of smoke. A woman might arrive with flour on her sleeves while a shepherd stood nearby with a hazel staff. There, beneath the eyes of the priest reeve or steward, the order would be read aloud. For many, this was the moment when distant politics became personal. A war they had never seen against an enemy whose name they barely knew now meant that their household owed coin grain, labour, or livestock. No one can quite agree whether ordinary villagers always understood the official reason given for such levies. Some probably did, for news travelled through markets, monasteries, inns, and returning soldiers. Others may have heard only that the king required help, that refusal would bring a fine, or that names would be entered upon a roll. How much each person owed depended on the tax and the place. Some levies were based on land, others on movable property hearths, households, livestock, or estimated wealth. In some regions, respected local men were required to assess their neighbours. This made the process familiar and uncomfortable. The assessor knew who had lost a cow in spring, who had hidden barley in a cousin's loft, who possessed a silver cup, and who only appeared prosperous because a borrowed cloak had been worn to church. The announcement did not always produce shouting or open resistance. More often it brought silence. Villagers performed the quiet arithmetic of survival. A penny paid to the crown could not buy salt. Grain surrendered in autumn could mean thinner pottage in February. A hen taken as payment was not merely a bird, but a source of eggs, broth, feathers, and perhaps future chicks. Still, medieval people were accustomed to obligations. Rent days, tithe payments, harvest services, mill fees, and manor fines already shaped the year. Certain feast days served as familiar deadlines, and a debt due at Michaelmas or Martinmas could be remembered alongside turning leaves and the slaughtering of livestock before winter. Some believed lawful payment preserved order under God, while unjust demands endangered ruler and realm. Preachers sometimes warned that oppression of the poor was a grave sin, though such warnings did not always lighten the burden. As evening returned, the village settled again. Smoke rose from low roofs. Cattle shifted behind wattled walls. A last bell sounded from the stone church, and footsteps faded along the lane. Inside cottages, families spoke quietly beside small fires, perhaps counting coins on a worn table, or wondering which sack of grain could be spared. Far away in the castle chamber where the demand had begun, a clerk dipped his quill and waited for the first reports. Between that quill and the sleeping village stretched the machinery of medieval taxation seals roads, bells, memory, fear, custom, and the fragile promise that authority would be obeyed. The collectors themselves had not yet arrived, but their shadow was already moving across the fields. The shadow usually arrived in the shape of men carrying authority they had not created for themselves. Some came on horseback wrapped in damp wool and accompanied by servants. Others walked beside pack animals burdened with parchment rolls, ink horns, wax tablets, and small wooden chests for coin. Their titles differed from place to place. They might be sheriffs, bailiffs, reeves, stewards, sergeants, beadles, or clerks. Some were appointed by the crown, some by a lord, and some were chosen from within the village itself. Together they formed the long and uneven chain through which a royal demand reached the poorest household. The most powerful among them was often the sheriff. In much of medieval England, the sheriff represented the king within a county, collecting royal revenues, summoning juries, enforcing judgments, and answering for large sums at the royal treasury. Yet the sheriff rarely visited every cottage personally. He depended on lesser officers who knew the lanes, fields, families, and old disputes of each manor. A bailiff might supervise several estates, arriving at intervals to inspect accounts and question local officials. His authority could be announced by a staff badge seal or written warrant. Such objects mattered because many villagers had no way to verify a stranger's claims. A document bearing recognizable wax witnessed by a priest or steward carried more weight than spoken threats alone. Some chroniclers claimed that false collectors occasionally exploited this trust, though no one can quite agree how widespread such deception truly was. Closer to daily village life stood the reeve. Unlike a distant royal officer, the reeve was often a local peasant selected to manage the manor's work. He organised ploughing, watched over livestock, supervised harvest labour, and helped gather rents and dues. His position brought limited authority but little peace. He lived among the people whose obligations he recorded. He knew which roof leaked, which family had buried a parent, and whose barley had failed after heavy rain. In some manors, tenants elected the reeve each year, though the honour could feel more like a burden. A man might attempt to avoid selection by paying a fine or presenting a reason why he was unsuitable. The office required time away from his own fields and exposed him to suspicion from both sides. If he collected too harshly, neighbours remembered. If he collected too little, the Lord's steward accused him of negligence. The reeve often worked with the hayward, who guarded hedges, crops and common pastures, and with the constable, who helped maintain local order. A beadle might carry messages, summon people to court, or seize goods from those who failed to pay. These officers were not a neat professional service. They were a shifting group of local men, household servants, minor officials and literate clerks whose duties overlapped according to custom. The clerk remained especially important because taxation depended increasingly upon written records. He carried quills trimmed with a small knife cakes of ink parchment sheets, and perhaps a horn container strapped to his belt. In cold weather, ink might thicken, fingers might stiffen, and candles smoked in draughty halls. Still, names had to be entered, figures added, and payments marked. The clerk's handwriting could be more frightening than a sword. Once a debt appeared on a roll, it might follow a household through seasons of poor harvest and illness. A mark beside a name could indicate payment exemption, arrears, or death. Most villagers could not read the Latin or French in which official records were often written, but they understood the authority of the page. A man might press his personal seal into wax if he possessed one. Others made a simple mark while witnesses watched. Collectors rarely travelled alone. Roads were unsafe and coin invited robbery. An officer might bring armed servants carrying spears or short swords, not necessarily to attack villagers, but to discourage resistance and protect the revenue on its journey. Their presence changed the mood of a settlement. Dogs barked. Children were called indoors. Doors remained closed longer than usual, though oak latches offered little defence against lawful entry. Hospitality complicated these visits. Officials required food, beds, fodder and shelter, and local communities were sometimes expected to provide them. A collector arriving at dusk could consume bread ale, smoked fish, cheese and firewood before taking a place near the hall hearth. His horses needed oats and dry straw. Even before a single payment was gathered, the village might already bear the expense of his arrival. Some officials accepted modest meals as part of customary duty. Others demanded more than custom allowed. A fat capon, a jug of better ale or a length of cloth might encourage a favourable judgment. The line between hospitality and bribery was often deliberately unclear. A gift freely offered could become a payment silently expected the next time, yet it would be misleading to imagine every collector as a cruel stranger. Many were ordinary men trapped within the same harsh structures as those they visited. A local reeve might dread confronting a widow who lacked the pennies recorded against her name. A clerk might reduce a figure after noticing that a household had lost livestock. A bailiff might delay collection until after market day. Such mercy existed, though it was rarely guaranteed. Other officials found profit in fear. They added unauthorized fees, exaggerated debts, or threatened seizure before payment was truly overdue. They might claim expenses for journeys never made or retain a portion of what they collected. Because accounts passed through several hands missing coin could be blamed upon confusion, bad roads, dishonest subordinates, or villagers who had supposedly refused to pay. Royal governments knew this danger. Officers were sometimes required to swear oaths before saints' relics or upon the Gospels. The oath bound them to collect lawfully and keep accurate accounts. Breaking it endangered not only reputation but the soul. Medieval people took such promises seriously, though fear of divine judgment did not always overcome the temptations of silver. When collectors entered a manor hall, they often sat behind a heavy table scarred by years of use. Villagers waited along the walls or beneath soot-dark rafters. The steward spoke first. The clerk unrolled parchment. Local jurors chosen from respected tenants might be called to confirm who owned land, who had inherited property, and who had concealed goods. Outside, rain tapped against the roof. Water ran through the ruts of the lane, and the monastery bell beyond the fields sounded the late hour. Those waiting could hear horses shifting under a shelter and the low murmur of neighbours. Firelight moved over faces while names were called one by one. The authority in the room belonged not to any single man, but to the objects before him: the seal, the staff, the account roll, the witness, and the distant ruler whose command had travelled through them all. The collector could be disliked, mocked quietly, or cursed after he departed. Yet while he sat beneath the wavering candles reading from the page, he carried the weight of castle walls far beyond the horizon. Once the names had been called, and the authority of the collectors accepted, the quieter work of measuring began. Medieval taxation was rarely as simple as placing a fixed price upon every household. Wealth had to be discovered, estimated, remembered, and sometimes guessed. It hid in strips of ploughed earth, in cattle standing behind woven fences, in sacks of barley beneath rafters, and in small objects wrapped carefully inside chests. The collector's first question was often not how much coin a family possessed, but what kind of life they appeared to live. Land remained the clearest sign of wealth. A man who held several acres of fertile ground was expected to contribute more than a labourer with only a garden patch. Yet medieval fields were divided into long scattered strips, and ownership was tangled by custom. One household might cultivate land near the church, another strip beyond the brook, and a third beside neighbours' oats. Some ground belonged to the lord's demesne, some to free tenants, and some was held in exchange for labour rather than money. Local jurors therefore became essential. These were usually men of the village who knew the boundaries marked by hedges, stones, old trees, shallow ditches, and memories passed from father to son. They might stand before the collector and swear that a tenant held half a virgate 3 meadow strips and the right to graze 4 animals on the common. No one can quite agree whether such testimony was usually fair. Personal rivalries, family loyalties, and old quarrels could easily influence what was remembered. Livestock offered another measure. Cattle suggested access to pasture and strength for ploughing. Sheep represented wool, milk, meat, and future lambs. Pigs could be driven into woodland during autumn to feed upon acorns and beech mast, a practice known as pannage. Even geese, hens, and beehives might be counted when officials tried to estimate what a household could afford. Counting animals was not always easy. Herds wandered across common ground and ownership might be shared. A widow could keep a cow belonging partly to her brother. 2 families might raise pigs together and divide the meat after slaughter. An animal loaned to a neighbour could conveniently disappear from view on the morning of assessment. Collectors were not unaware of such tricks. A bailiff might send men toward barns, folds, orchards, and pasture edges. Fresh hoofprints in the mud could betray animals moved during the night. The sound of a hidden calf behind a wall of bundled reeds might undo a carefully prepared story. Medieval villagers understood their landscape intimately, but so did local officers who had grown up among the same lanes. Hearths were another tempting way to count households. A fire usually meant a dwelling, and a dwelling usually meant people who could be taxed. Officials might inspect chimneys, roof openings, or traces of smoke. Yet one hearth could serve several families, while a poor household might keep no fire during mild weather to save wood. Some dwellings contained more than one fireplace, especially inns, manor houses, and prosperous workshops. In later medieval communities, hearth taxes could encourage people to block unused fireplaces or insist that an old cooking place had long been abandoned. Those who recorded the story never fully agreed on how often officials entered private homes to inspect them. Customs varied greatly, and even a lawful search could provoke resentment. A doorway marked the boundary between public authority and domestic life, and villagers were reluctant to invite strangers beyond it. Inside, possessions spoke quietly. An iron cooking pot was valuable. So was a sturdy chest with a lock, a bronze buckle, a wool blanket, a painted cup, or a set of metal tools. Most household goods were ordinary and worn wooden bowls, horn spoons, clay jugs, baskets, benches, mattresses stuffed with straw, and garments repaired, until the original cloth was difficult to see. Collectors assessing movable wealth had to decide which objects represented genuine prosperity and which were necessary for survival. A ploughshare might be worth money, but taking it could prevent future cultivation. A loom could be assessed as property, yet it might also provide the family's only income. Some regulations protected essential tools, bedding, or cooking vessels, though protection on parchment did not always survive an impatient visit. Harvests were examined with equal care. Grain stood at the heart of medieval life. Wheat made the finest bread, while rye, barley, and oats fed a much larger part of the population. Peas and beans thickened pottage, and hay kept animals alive through winter. Officials could estimate wealth by the number of sheaves in a barn, the acreage sown, or the amount delivered to a mill. Mills themselves revealed much. In many manors, tenants were required to grind grain at the lord's mill and pay a portion as a fee. Mill records could therefore expose households that claimed to have harvested very little. Bakers' ovens, wine presses, fish ponds, dovecotes, and brewing equipment also attracted attention because they signalled production beyond bare subsistence. Ale was brewed in countless homes, usually by women, and sold in small quantities to neighbours. An alewife who brewed regularly might owe fees or face inspection by local officers responsible for checking measures and quality. A bundle of leaves or a wooden sign hung outside could announce that fresh ale was ready. For an assessor, the brewing tub molten cups suggested income. For the household, they represented long hours of soaking grain, tending heat, and carrying water. Even clothing could become evidence. A fur-lined hood, silver clasp, or brightly dyed gown suggested resources, though appearances deceived. Garments passed through families were borrowed for feast days or purchased second-hand at market. A prosperous-looking cloak might cover a man whose grain stores were nearly empty. Some chroniclers complained that ordinary people dressed above their station, but such complaints often revealed more about social anxiety than actual wealth. To avoid being assessed too heavily, villagers concealed what they could. Grain sacks were moved into lofts belonging to relatives. Coins were buried in clay pots beneath floors or hidden inside walls. Better cups and blankets vanished before officials arrived. Livestock was driven toward woodland clearings or distant pasture. Saints' days, market gatherings, and pilgrimages offered believable reasons for people and goods to be absent, yet concealment carried risks. Neighbours could inform whether from duty, fear, or spite. Manor courts sometimes fined those who gave false testimony. An oath taken on holy relics was thought to place the liar's soul in danger. Some believed that perjury might bring illness, failed crops, or sudden misfortune. Although practical fear of punishment was probably stronger than superstition for many. As daylight faded, the measuring continued. Candle stubs were replaced. The clerk rubbed tired fingers and bent closer to the page. Outside the hall, mist crossed the winter fields, softening hedges and distant trees. A church bell sounded through the damp air, and somewhere behind the cottages a dog answered. The figures forming on the parchment seemed precise, but they rested upon uncertain foundations. Remembered boundaries, estimated harvests, hidden livestock, borrowed clothing, and statements shaped by fear. Medieval taxation tried to turn a living village into numbers, but a village was never only acreage, animals, hearths, and possessions. It was a web of favours, needs, secrets, and quiet agreements that no ledger could fully contain. Still, the totals had to be written. One by one, households became lines of ink, their uncertain lives reduced to sums that would soon be carried away from the village. Those sums of ink did not stand alone. Long before a royal levy reached the village, most peasant households already lived beneath a web of obligations that seemed to tighten with every season. The king's demand might be extraordinary, but the manor's demands were ordinary, repeated so often that they became part of the rhythm of life, like the turning of the plough or the sounding of the church bell. A tenant's first duty was usually rent. Some paid in coin, though silver was often scarce. Others paid in grain eggs, hens, wool, honey, or a portion of the harvest. A small holding might owe a set number of measures of oats at Michaelmas, a goose at Christmas, and several days of work during the busiest weeks of the year. The exact mixture depended upon local custom, and no one can quite agree how consistently these customs were enforced from one manor to another. Custom was powerful because it was remembered as much as it was written. An elderly tenant might insist that his family had always owed 2 hens, never 3. A steward might point to an old roll and claim otherwise. The dispute could turn upon faded ink, imperfect memory, or the testimony of neighbours who had reasons to favour one side. In such moments, the manor court became both courtroom and memory chamber. The court usually met in a hall barn or other large building belonging to the lord. Tenants gathered before a steward seated at a heavy table. Local men formed a jury and answered questions about land inheritance, broken fences, stray animals, unpaid rent, and neglected labour. The proceedings could stretch through much of the day. Ale was passed, boots dried near the hearth, and the smell of damp wool mixed with smoke beneath the rafters. The steward did not invent every rule. Much of manorial life depended upon long-established expectations, yet those expectations often favoured the lord. A tenant might be required to spend several days each week working the demesne, the portion of land reserved for the manor. He could plough sow weed, cut hay, repair hedges, carry timber, clean ditches, or harvest grain that would not feed his own family. These labour services were especially painful during harvest. Every household needed to gather its own crops before rain rot or birds destroyed them. Yet the lord's fields often came first. Men and women were summoned at dawn, sometimes with sickles carts or draught animals of their own. They worked beneath the watch of reeves and bailiffs while their private strips waited beyond the hedges. Some manors provided food during these compulsory labour days. A worker might receive bread, cheese, onions, pottage and weak ale. On major harvest occasions, the meal could be better, perhaps including meat or fish. Such generosity was not entirely kindness. A fed labourer worked longer, and an orderly meal helped keep dozens of people gathered under authority. Still, the burden was felt deeply. A family that lost 3 days to the Lord's harvest might face worsening weather when it finally returned to its own grain. One autumn storm could make the difference between full sacks and sprouting sheaves. Some tenants attempted to send weaker substitutes, arrive late, or work slowly. Others paid cash in place of labour when such commutation was allowed. The manor also charged for using facilities it controlled. Tenants might be required to grind grain at the lord's mill, bake bread in his oven, or press grapes in his wine press. Each service carried a fee. A family caught grinding grain secretly with a hand quern could be fined, and millstones were sometimes confiscated or broken. The rule seemed petty, but mill income was valuable, and lords guarded it carefully. The same principle applied to pasture and woodland. Pigs feeding on autumn mast could require a pannage payment. Cutting firewood, gathering dead branches, digging peat, or grazing animals in common fields might depend upon recognised rights. A poor household could find itself fined for taking too much wood, even during a bitter winter. The forest offered shelter and fuel, but it was never entirely free. Marriage could produce another payment. In some communities, an unfree tenant needed permission for a daughter to marry outside the manor. The fee, often called merchi in parts of England, compensated the lord for the possible loss of labour and descendants. Historians continue to debate how widely and harshly this custom was applied, but where it existed, it made a private family decision part of the lord's revenue. Death brought no final release. When a tenant died, the heir might owe a heriot, often the best animal or another valuable possession. A widow could watch the manor's officers lead away the strongest ox just when the household most needed it. The heir then paid an entry fine to take possession of the holding. One generation's death became the next generation's debt. There were smaller fines as well. Animals wandering into crops, broken fences, brewing ale with an incorrect measure, failing to attend court, neglecting road repairs or allowing a ditch to clog could all result in payment. The amounts might be modest, but repeated fines accumulated like rainwater in a rut. A few pennies lost here and there could empty a household purse before the next market day. Then there was the tithe owed to the church. In principle, 1/10 of certain produce supported the parish priest church building and religious life of the community. Grain, lambs, wool, honey, fruit and other goods might be set aside. Tithe barns stood near some churches or monasteries, their great roofs sheltering the collected produce of many farms. The tithe carried spiritual weight. Refusing it was not simply an economic offence, but a danger to the soul. Priests reminded parishioners that the first share belonged to God. Yet disputes were common. Was the 10th bundle properly measured? Did garden vegetables count? What of eggs, flax, or young animals? Some villagers suspected priests or monastic collectors of taking more than was due, while church officials complained that peasants presented their poorest sheaves. A lesser-known custom required some households to bring offerings at particular feast days, funerals, weddings, or churchings after childbirth. Candles, bread, coin, and wax could all become part of religious obligation. Beeswax was especially prized because it burned more cleanly than tallow. A large candle before a saint's image represented devotion, but it also represented labour hives and expense. The peasant household therefore lived beneath overlapping claims. The lord demanded rent and service. The church asked for tithes and offerings. The king might impose a levy. Local officers collected tolls, fines, and fees. None of these demands alone always destroyed a family, but together they narrowed the margin between security and hunger. At night, after court had ended, the hall emptied slowly. Men pulled cloaks around their shoulders and stepped into the cold. Frost silvered the ruts of the road. A lantern moved toward the manor house, while others disappeared along narrow paths toward cottages where fires had burned low. Inside those cottages, families counted what remained: a sack of oats, 2 hens, a little salt, a strip of smoked bacon hanging from a beam. The obligations of the manor were not abstract rules. They were measured against every meal, every winter blanket, and every animal breathing behind the wall. And still, when the next bell called the village together, they would return to the hall because custom, fear, necessity, and hope held the manor in place more securely than stone. Beyond the manor hall, obligation followed people onto the road. A peasant carrying eggs to market, a merchant driving pack horses beneath dripping trees, a pilgrim walking toward a distant shrine, or a shepherd guiding sheep through a town gate could all be stopped and asked to pay. The charge might be called a toll, custom, passage fee, pontage, mirage, stallage, or market due. Its name changed with place and purpose, but the experience was familiar. Before the traveller could continue, someone claimed a share. Medieval roads were rarely smooth or clearly marked. They bent around fields, crossed streams at uncertain places, and disappeared beneath mud during wet months. Wagon wheels cut deep ruts that filled with brown water. Thorn hedges narrowed the way, while branches brushed against cloaks and bundles. A traveller might recognise the approach to a toll point by a wooden barrier across the road, a small booth beside a bridge, or an armed man waiting near the gate of a walled town. Bridges were especially valuable. A stone bridge could survive floods that destroyed timber crossings, but maintaining it required labour and money. Lords' towns, monasteries, and sometimes religious brotherhoods collected pontage to pay for repairs. A cart loaded with wool might owe more than a man on foot. Cattle, sheep, pigs, and horses could each be charged separately, forcing drovers to count animals while they shifted impatiently in the rain. Some bridges contained small chapels where travellers prayed before crossing. Saints associated with safe passage were honoured with candles or tiny offerings, and it was not unusual for a traveller to make both a religious gift and a practical payment within a few steps. Whether every bridge toll truly funded maintenance is uncertain. Some records suggest genuine repair work, while others reveal that old charges continued long after the original purpose had faded. Town gates presented another interruption. Walls protected community from raids, fire, and disorder, but they also created convenient places to inspect goods. Gatekeepers watched merchants enter with baskets, barrels, cloth hides, fish salt, or grain. The gate might close at sunset, leaving late arrivals outside with their animals and merchandise until morning. A merchant reaching the gate after a long journey could face several questions. Where had the goods come from? What quantity did he carry? Were they intended for sale? Had duties already been paid elsewhere? Officials might examine seals, tally sticks, or written permits. Measures varied between towns, and a barrel considered lawful in one market might be questioned in another. Many traders learned to expect delay. They carried small coins where they could be reached easily and kept better silver hidden beneath clothing or inside saddlebags. A toll collector who spent too long inspecting every bundle might receive a modest gift to speed the process. The difference between a voluntary courtesy and an unofficial fee was often left unspoken. Once inside the town, the traveller met further charges. Stolage was paid for the right to set up a stall in the market. Merchants selling grain, cloth, pottery tools, or food might be assigned specific spaces according to local custom. A fish seller stood near other fish sellers. Butchers gathered where blood and waste could be washed away. Cloth merchants favoured covered halls where rain would not ruin their goods. Market officials checked weights and measures. Iron weights, wooden bushel vessels, and measuring rods were kept as local standards. A seller using a false measure could be fined, publicly shamed, or lose the offending vessel. Bakers sometimes faced punishment if loaves were too light, and ale sellers could be charged for poor quality or dishonest cups. One lesser-known practice involved the assize of bread and ale, through which authorities attempted to regulate price, weight, and quality according to the cost of grain. In theory, this protected buyers. In practice, enforcement varied. Some officials were diligent, while others overlooked faults for neighbours, relatives, or those willing to offer a drink. Pilgrims also encountered tolls, though some claimed exemptions. A traveller wearing a pilgrim badge from Canterbury, Santiago, Rome, or another shrine might hope to be treated with charity. Badges of pewter were pinned to hats or cloaks as signs of devotion and proof of a completed journey. Yet a badge did not always open every gate freely. Collectors could suspect false pilgrims, wandering labourers, or traders, disguising merchandise beneath religious clothing. Monasteries sometimes offered hospitality to genuine travellers, providing bread pottage, straw bedding, and a place near the fire. The guest hall could become crowded on major pilgrimage routes. Wet cloaks steamed beside the hearth, staffs leaned against stone walls, and tired feet were rubbed with animal fat or herbal salves. Garlic, plantain, and comfrey were among the plants associated with common remedies, though no one can quite agree how effective such treatments were beyond comfort and cleanliness. Roadside shrines offered quieter pauses. A traveller might leave a bent coin, a thread from a garment, or a small stone beneath a carved saint. Some carried charms against robbery or misfortune. A prayer written on parchment could be folded into a pouch, while herbs such as mugwort were believed in some regions to protect those making long journeys. Protection was needed because toll stations were not the only places where travellers lost money. Robbers watched narrow roads, forest edges, and isolated crossings. Even lawful collectors could resemble bandits when they appeared without clear insignia. A merchant confronted by armed men had little time to decide whether the demand came from a lord of town or simple theft. Disputes sometimes arose over ancient rights. A monastery might claim exemption from a bridge toll granted by a king generations earlier. Town officials might reject the charter or question its seal. Merchants belonging to certain guilds possessed privileges in favoured markets, while outsiders paid full dues. A disagreement could leave carts waiting for hours as clerks searched chests for documents. The poor experienced these delays differently from wealthy traders. A large merchant could include tolls in the price of his goods. A woman carrying a basket of onions or a few cheeses had less room to absorb the charge. A single penny might represent a significant portion of her earnings. She could avoid the official road, cross a shallow stream, or enter through a lesser path, but evasion brought the risk of seizure and fines. Collectors knew the hidden ways. They watched footpaths through meadows, unofficial fords, and gaps in town walls. Local informants reported those who avoided payment. Confiscated goods might be held until the owner paid both the original toll and an added penalty. Eggs broke, fish spoiled, and vegetables wilted while arguments continued. Still the market drew people onward. It offered salt needles, iron tools, dyed cloth, gossip news, and companionship beyond the boundaries of the manor. Bells announced the opening of trade. Animals crowded the square vendors called across wooden stalls, and smoke rose from cooking fires, where travellers bought hot pies or bowls of thick stew. By evening the road grew quiet again. The gates closed, the stalls emptied, and abandoned rushes lay crushed beneath muddy boots. Outside the walls, moonlight rested upon the bridge while water moved darkly beneath its arches. A lone collector gathered the day's coins into a leather pouch and marked the total upon a wax tablet. Each payment was small, often no more than a few worn pieces of silver, yet multiplied across bridges, markets, gates, ferries, and roads. These coins became another current flowing away from ordinary hands. The traveller continued onward, but never entirely freely, for nearly every path through the medieval landscape seemed to belong to someone. The coins gathered at gates and bridges eventually reached the table of a clerk, where the movement of travellers' animals, grain and silver was transformed into lines of ink. The collector's ledger was not always a bound book in the modern sense. It might be a long parchment roll, a group of folded sheets, a wax tablet used for temporary figures, or a narrow strip covered with names and sums. Some records were kept carefully in chests. Others travelled inside leather cases tied to a saddle exposed to rain, mud, candle smoke, and the careless hands of tired officials. Parchment was valuable. It required animal skins to be cleaned, stretched, scraped, dried, and cut. A clerk therefore wrote closely fitting words into narrow spaces and using abbreviations that could confuse anyone unfamiliar with his hand. Latin remained common in official accounts, while French or the local spoken language might appear in notes, names, or explanations. Many of the people whose property was recorded could not read any of it. This gave the written page a strange power. A villager might remember paying 2 pennies at the manor hall, but if the clerk failed to mark the payment, memory stood against ink. Witnesses could help, as could a tally stick or token. Yet the record usually carried the stronger authority. No one can quite agree how often genuine mistakes became permanent debts, though surviving accounts reveal corrections, crossed-out figures, and cramped additions squeezed between earlier lines. The clerk's tools were simple but essential. His quill, usually cut from a large bird's feather, needed constant trimming. A small penknife shaped the point and scraped away errors. Ink might be made from oak galls mixed with iron salts and gum, producing dark writing that could remain visible for centuries. Sand or fine powder was scattered across fresh ink to help it dry. Beside these tools lay seals, cords, wax, and perhaps counters used for arithmetic. Medieval accountants did not always calculate by writing figures directly. They could use a counting board divided into spaces for different values, placing small stones or metal tokens upon it. The word counter itself came to describe both the object and the place where accounts were handled. A lesser-known practice involved the tally stick. A debt or payment was cut as notches into a piece of wood, often hazel. The stick was then split lengthwise so that both pieces carried matching marks. One half remained with the official while the other went to the payer. Because the uneven grain and notches matched only their original partner, the pieces could be fitted together later as proof, for someone unable to read such a stick offered more reassurance than a page covered in Latin. It could be wrapped in cloth hidden in a chest or kept near household valuables. Yet wooden proof was easily lost to fire, damp insects, or simple misfortune. A cottage roof leaked, a child moved the wrong bundle, or a winter blaze consumed everything stored beside the hearth. The ledger attempted to prevent such uncertainty by recording every stage. The clerk noted who owed payment, what had been received, what remained unpaid, and which collector was responsible for delivering it. He might enter a widow's name beside a reduced assessment, a tenant's death beside an inherited holding, or a villager's request for delay after a failed harvest. Exemptions demanded equal care. Monasteries, nobles, royal servants, and privileged towns could hold charters releasing them from particular taxes or tolls. Some exemptions were ancient, copied from documents whose seals had cracked with age. Others were temporary rewards for military service, loyalty, or assistance to the crown. A clerk confronting such a claim had to decide whether the charter was genuine and whether its wording applied to the current demand. Forgery was always possible. Medieval documents depended heavily on seals, witnesses, and recognized formulas, but a skilled imitator could produce something persuasive. Some chroniclers described false charters appearing during disputes over land and taxation. Historians still debate how frequently officials were deceived, for successful forgeries were rarely announced as such. Arrears filled many roles. These were debts carried forward because a household manor town or collector had failed to pay the full amount. A poor harvest, livestock, disease, war, fire, or flood could leave an entire community behind. Yet officials higher in the system still expected the total. The local collector might therefore be held personally responsible for missing revenue. This created pressure to be severe. A sheriff who had promised the king a certain sum could not simply report that villagers were poor. In some systems, he paid an agreed amount to the treasury and kept whatever additional revenue he managed to collect. Such arrangements encouraged efficiency, but they also invited abuse. Every extra penny could become profit. The accounts therefore recorded not only villagers' debts, but officials' debts to one another. A bailiff answered to a steward to a lord, and a sheriff to royal officers. At the highest level, accounts were examined in formal sessions where collectors presented money documents and explanations. Missing sums could lead to fines, dismissal, imprisonment, or the seizure of property. Even an honest official could become trapped. A servant might disappear with a pouch of silver. Robbers might attack a revenue convoy. A ferry boat could overturn. Coins could be clipped counterfeit or rejected for being too worn. The ledger might show what should have arrived, while the chest revealed what actually remained. Coins themselves demanded inspection. Silver pennies varied in condition, and weighing could matter more than counting. Small balances and standardized weights helped officials test payment. A merchant might offer foreign coin accepted by weight, while a peasant brought pennies darkened through years of handling. Debased money, clipped edges and imitations caused suspicion. In some places, people paid with mixed offerings because coin was scarce. A clerk might record a quantity of oats, wool, cheese or livestock converted into a monetary value. This conversion was rarely neutral. Prices changed between seasons and markets. A hen worth one amount in summer might be valued differently in winter. Those who controlled the account could choose a rate favourable to themselves. The working room grew crowded as the day continued. Messengers arrived with folded warrants, collectors opened leather bags and poured coins onto the table. Wax tablets were compared with parchment rolls. A servant carried in bread, onions, and a jug of ale, leaving the men to eat without abandoning their calculations. Rushlights burned more cheaply than beeswax candles, though they smoked and gave little light. They were made by dipping the dried pith of rushes in animal fat. In a poor office or minor manor hall, several might be fixed in simple holders along the wall. Their weak flames left the corners dark and made careful writing difficult. Outside evening settled over the roofs. Rain whispered against shutters and wind moved through the bare branches near the churchyard. The village had become quiet, but the clerk remained bent above his work, his shadow stretching across the parchment whenever the flame moved. A name entered incorrectly could burden a family. A debt left unmarked could return the following year. An exemption overlooked could lead to seizure. The ledger did not shout, threaten, or ride armed through the countryside. It waited silently in a chest, preserving every demand long after the collector's footsteps had faded, and in that silence lay much of its darker power. Memory softened with time, but ink did not. A spoken promise could be forgotten, a compassionate delay denied, and a payment made beneath a rainy market awning reduced to nothing if the proper mark never appeared. By the time the final roll was tied and sealed, the village had become a column of figures once more. Its muddy lanes, empty cupboards, sick animals, and anxious families had vanished behind sums that seemed orderly, exact, and beyond argument. When the figures had been checked, and the final amount announced, payment still had to be found. For wealthy merchants, prosperous abbeys, and great landowners, this often meant silver coin drawn from strong boxes or carried in sealed leather bags. For ordinary households, however, money was only one part of wealth, and frequently the least available part. A peasant family might possess grain in the loft, a few hens near the door, a pig behind a woven fence, and tools, worn smooth by years of use, yet have only 2 or 3 pennies hidden inside a clay vessel. Coin entered village life through markets, seasonal labour, military wages, the sale of wool and small trades. It departed quickly through rents, tolls, fines, salt purchases and church offerings. The silver penny was the foundation of many medieval payments, though actual coinage differed across regions and centuries. Pennies could be divided in practice by cutting them into halves or quarters, creating halfpennies and farthings when smaller change was needed. A clean cross stamped upon some coins helped guide the cut. This lesser-known habit was useful in markets where even a whole penny might purchase more than a poor buyer required. Collectors preferred recognized coin of acceptable weight. A household arriving with clipped, damaged, or foreign money could face delay while each piece was examined. The collector might place coins upon a balance, turn them beneath the light, or bite an edge in a rough attempt to judge the metal. Some coins had passed through so many hands that the ruler's face was barely visible. Counterfeit money inspired particular fear. Producing false coin was treated not merely as theft, but as an attack upon royal authority. Punishments could be severe, though no one can quite agree how accurately ordinary people distinguished deliberate counterfeits from worn or debased currency. A peasant accepting a suspicious penny at market might later discover that an official refused it entirely. When coin could not be found, payment might be taken in grain. Sacks of wheat, barley or oats were measured in the manor yard while clerks recorded the quantity. Wooden vessels served as official measures, though their sizes varied between towns and estates. The grain was poured levelled and inspected for moisture, stones, husks, or signs of spoilage. Disputes began easily. A collector might reject grain as too damp, or claim that the measure had not been filled properly. The payer might insist that the official vessel was larger than custom allowed. In some places the grain was struck level with a wooden rod, elsewhere it could be heaped above the rim. The difference between a level and heaped measure might represent several meals for a household. Autumn collections filled barns and granaries near castles, manor houses and monasteries. The air inside smelled of dust, straw, mice and dry earth. Cats moved quietly among the sacks, valued less as pets than as defenders of stored food. Wooden bins were raised above the ground to reduce damp, while herbs or ash might be scattered in attempts to discourage pests. Even carefully stored grain could disappear through rot, theft, rats, or careless handling. Collectors, therefore, sometimes demanded slightly more than the recorded obligation to cover expected loss. To the official, this was practical accounting. To the family surrendering its harvest, it felt like punishment for grain not yet spoiled. Animals were accepted when they formed part of customary rent, or when goods were seized to satisfy debt. Hens were common payments because they were easy to transport and possessed a recognized value. A tenant might owe a pair at Christmas or another feast day. Geese, lambs, pigs, and cattle represented larger sums and were more difficult to surrender. A hen taken from a poor cottage removed more than a single meal. It removed eggs from future mornings, chicks from future springs, and broth for illness or childbirth. A pig represented months of feeding on scraps, weeds, and woodland mast. Its slaughter could provide salted meat through winter fat for cooking, bristles for brushes, and bladder skin for household use. Cattle carried even greater importance. An ox was a source of power, drawing the plough through heavy soil. If officers seized the strongest animal, the family might be unable to cultivate its strips properly. Neighbours could lend help, but borrowed draft power came with obligations of its own. Some local customs tried to protect essential plough animals, though enforcement depended upon the collector and the urgency of the debt. Seizure usually began with goods considered replaceable. A cloak, cooking pot, chess tool, or bundle of wool might be taken and held until payment was made. Officials sometimes announced that seized property would be sold at market after a certain number of days. This gave relatives or neighbours time to lend coin, though loans could begin another chain of obligation. The arrival of officers for distraint as such seizure was often known changed the atmosphere of a household. The oak door opened reluctantly. A clerk named the debt while a beadle or servant searched for goods of sufficient value. The family watched each object being judged. A bench was too common. A bronze pot was useful. A wool blanket was valuable but necessary in winter. Widows and the elderly were especially vulnerable. Their property might appear modest, yet collectors still had totals to meet. A widow could plead that the cow belonged partly to her son, or that the grain had been set aside as seed. Witnesses might support her, but compassion varied. Some officials delayed the taking, others followed the record without pause. Communities sometimes responded quietly. A neighbour purchased the seized animal at auction and returned it later. Relatives concealed better tools before the officers arrived. Villagers claimed that a pig belonged to the parish priest, or that stored barley had already been promised as tithe. Whether these explanations were believed often depended upon local relationships rather than strict evidence. Payment in goods created difficulties for collectors as well. Animals had to be fed, driven, guarded, and sold. Grain required carts and dry storage. Wool could be damaged by rain. A collector might therefore accept less than the official value if paid promptly in coin, or demand more when forced to receive bulky produce. This opened the door to private bargaining. A household owing 5 shillings might offer grain valued at nearly that amount along with a hen and a small silver payment. The clerk converted each item into figures. The valuation could be generous or harsh. One official might recognize the family's hardship. Another might undervalue everything and leave arrears on the roll. By late afternoon, the manor yard became crowded with the material weight of taxation. Sacks rested against stone walls. Hens clucked inside wicker cages. Sheep pulled at ropes, and a frightened pig strained against 2 men trying to guide it toward a cart. Farmers waited beside heaps of produce while clerks called names from parchment. Beyond the yard, the winter fields lay pale beneath low clouds. Smoke rose slowly from cottage roofs, and the bell of the stone church carried across the damp air. As darkness gathered, lanterns appeared along the lane, each flame moving toward a household now quieter and poorer than it had been that morning. Inside, supper was prepared from what remained. Pottage simmered over the fire, perhaps thinner than before. Bread was divided carefully. A child asked where the hen had gone or why the good blanket had been carried away. The answer was rarely simple enough for a child, and perhaps not entirely clear even to the adults. The tax had been paid at least in part. Yet payment was not a single moment. It continued through the missing eggs, the unploughed strip, the smaller winter store, and the cold felt beneath an inferior blanket. Coin vanished quickly into a collector's pouch. Grain and animals left more slowly, carrying pieces of the household's future with them. Between the official amount written in the ledger and the goods finally carried from the yard lay a space filled with negotiation. Medieval taxation often presented itself as fixed, lawful, and beyond dispute, yet its daily enforcement depended upon conversations held beside doors, whispered agreements beneath rafters, and gifts passed from one hand to another. A collector could not always take everything the record demanded. If he stripped a household of seed grain, the fields might remain unsown. If he seized the only ox, future rents would suffer. Practical officers understood that the survival of the taxpayer protected the survival of taxation itself. A delay reduction or revised valuation could therefore be sensible administration rather than kindness. Yet mercy rarely came without a price. A tenant might approach the reeve before the collection day carrying a small gift: a capon fattened on kitchen scraps, a round of cheese, a bundle of clean wool, or a jug of unusually strong ale. Nothing would be said directly. The tenant might mention a sick child, a flooded field, or a cow that had failed to calve. The reeve might listen, and later describe the household circumstances more favourably to the steward. Such offerings belonged to a world where gift helped maintain relationships. Food, drink, labour, and favours moved constantly between neighbours and households. A gift was not always understood as corruption. It could express gratitude, respect, loyalty, or an expectation of future assistance. The difficulty lay in knowing when courtesy became payment and when payment became extortion. No one can quite agree where medieval people themselves drew that boundary. Records condemn bribery, but they also show officials receiving customary meals, seasonal presents, and hospitality. A lord's servant arriving at Christmas might expect bread, meat, ale, and candles. A clerk could accept payment for preparing a document. A bailiff might receive gloves or cloth as part of an established fee. What appeared improper in one manner could be defended as ancient custom in another. The language of the exchange was often indirect. A villager did not necessarily ask an official to erase a debt. He might request that the matter be remembered with kindness. The official did not openly demand a bribe. He might complain about the hardship of his journey, the hunger of his horse, or the poor quality of the lodging provided. Those with experience learned to understand these signals. A farmer who produced only a cup of weak ale might find his grain measured strictly. A merchant who offered supper near the fire could have his goods inspected more quickly. A widow without anything to give depended upon sympathy, kinship, or the intervention of a priest. Clergy sometimes pleaded for struggling parishioners. A village priest knew which families had suffered illness, fire, or death. He could write a note for a literate official speak during a manor court, or remind a collector that Christian mercy toward the poor carried spiritual merit. Some collectors listened. Others may have considered such appeals merely another form of bargaining. Monasteries also negotiated. Although religious houses could be wealthy, they regularly claimed hardship caused by failed harvests, damaged buildings, hospitality expenses, or obligations to feed the poor. An abbot might send a representative with documents proving exemption from a levy. He might also send gifts from the monastery's estates, wine wax, fish cloth, or a carefully prepared meal. Wax was particularly valuable. Beeswax candles burned brightly and with less smoke than tallow, making them desirable in churches and prosperous households. A gift of candles to a clerk or steward could appear devotional while still carrying practical value. The candles might later illuminate the very table where the monastery's assessment was reconsidered. At higher levels, negotiation became more formal. Towns sometimes offered a single collective payment in return for relief from intrusive assessments. Merchants purchased privileges, allowing them to trade with reduced tolls. Lords bargained over military service taxes and exemptions. What a poor villager experienced as private pleading could become official policy when practiced by the powerful. Collectors themselves were under pressure to produce results. A sheriff expected to deliver a stated sum to the treasury might accept an immediate partial payment rather than pursue a doubtful debt for months. A bailiff facing resistance from an entire village could agree to revised figures to preserve order. The ledger might describe this as allowance, remission, composition, or delay. A lesser-known device in such arrangements was the surety. A neighbour, relative, or respected tenant promised to answer for another person's debt. If the payer failed, the guarantor became responsible. This allowed poor households to gain time, but it tied neighbours together through obligation. One man's bad harvest could become another man's loss. Sureties were announced before witnesses and entered into court rolls. A tenant might pledge a cloak, a tool, or livestock as security. Two neighbours could stand beside him and promise that payment would appear at the next feast day. Such arrangements rested upon reputation. A person known for unpaid debts found few willing supporters. Private loans filled the gap when official mercy failed. Coin might be borrowed from merchants, prosperous farmers, clergy, or local money lenders. The borrower could promise repayment in grain-wool labour or future income. Interest was condemned by the church under the broad prohibition against usury, yet profit could be concealed within exchange rates, fees, penalties, or differences between the amount lent and the amount repaid. Those who recorded these agreements did not always call them loans. A merchant might purchase a future harvest in advance at a low price. A creditor might receive the use of a field until the debt was cleared. A household desperate for tax money could therefore surrender several years of future value in return for a few immediate coins. Corrupt collectors exploited this desperation. An officer might threaten seizure, then privately offer to reduce the assessment for a gift. He could undervalue goods taken as payment and later sell them at full market price. He might charge a fee for entering a payment, another for issuing proof, and still another for travelling to the village. Because many people could not read the accounts, such abuses were difficult to prove. A clerk and collector working together controlled the figures. If a villager challenged them, they could insist that the debt had been misunderstood or that an additional fine was lawful. Witnesses often feared becoming the next target, yet officials did not enjoy unlimited freedom. Communities remembered patterns. A collector who demanded too many gifts found doors closing before he arrived. Villagers warned one another through messengers, market gossip and bells. Complaints could reach a Lord Bishop, Royal Council or travelling justice. Some officers were removed, fined, imprisoned or forced to repay money. Still, punishment was uncertain. Powerful patrons protected favoured servants. A corrupt official might share his profit with those above him or claim that harsh methods were necessary because the village was dishonest. Historians continue to debate how often complaints produced genuine justice rather than the replacement of one collector by another. As evening settled over, the manor bargains continued in quieter corners. A steward sat near the fire while supplicants waited upon a bench. The smell of roasted onions and damp wool filled the hall. A woman held a covered basket upon her knees. A farmer turned a small wooden tally between his fingers. Behind the table, the clerk listened without raising his eyes from the parchment. Outside, mist moved across the fields and the last monastery bell faded among the trees. Horses breathed beneath the stable roof. Rainwater slipped from the eaves into the dark yard where the day's collected sack still waited. Some who entered the hall emerged with an extension until Easter. Others carried a reduced figure, a new debt to a neighbour, or nothing but the knowledge that they had failed to offer enough. The law remained written in ink, but its weight had been adjusted by food, influence, reputation, and whispered promises. In this way, mercy became another kind of currency. Those with friends' gifts or useful connections could purchase gentleness. Those with nothing to offer had to depend upon conscience, and conscience was never entered reliably in any ledger. Those who possessed gifts, relatives, or influence could sometimes soften the collector's hand. Those who possessed none of these met the full weight of the demand. The poorest people in a medieval village were not always those with no property at all. Poverty shifted from season to season. A family might hold a cottage, a narrow garden, and several strips in the open fields, yet still reach winter with almost nothing to spare. One sick ox, one failed harvest, or one death in the household could turn modest security into debt. Day labourers lived closest to this edge. They earned bread or coin by digging ditches, repairing hedges, carrying stone, cutting wood, and helping during harvest. Winter shortened both daylight and available work, and a labourer might wait near a manor gate all morning only to return home with wet shoes and no wage. Widows faced dangers of their own. Some inherited land or continued a husband's trade, and medieval records reveal women managing property with considerable skill. Others lost access to draft animals, tools, or adult labour. Their legal position varied by region and status, and historians continue to debate how much protection customary law truly offered in practice. A right written in a court roll was useful only when someone had the strength and knowledge to defend it. Collectors often encountered households already weakened by other obligations. Rent remained due even when illness prevented work. Tithes were expected even from a reduced harvest. Fees might accompany inheritance, court appearances, or the use of a lord's mill. A royal tax placed over these burdens did not fall upon empty space. It landed upon debts already waiting. When payment failed, humiliation could begin before seizure. A debtor's name might be announced publicly in the manor court. Neighbours heard the sum and the length of the delay. The person could be ordered to stand before the steward, offer pledges, and explain why promises had not been kept. Medieval communities valued reputation because daily survival depended upon trust. Being known as unreliable made future borrowing far more difficult. There were also forms of pressure that left few marks. Officers could visit repeatedly, each arrival disturbing work and alarming the household. They could summon a debtor to distant courts, forcing travel along muddy roads and the loss of another day's labour. Fees might be added for warrants, messengers, and failed appearances. A small original debt grew through the cost of pursuing it. The poorest owned few objects worth taking. Their wooden bowls and stools brought little at market. Their patched clothing had almost no resale value. What remained valuable was essential cooking pot, a wool blanket, a goat, a hand tool or seed reserved for spring. Seizing anyone could deepen their poverty. The cooking pot was especially important. Iron cauldrons were costly and might pass through generations. Suspended above the hearth, the pot held the family's pottage, warmed water, and prepared herbal remedies. Taking it meant that even available food became harder to cook. Some customs discouraged officers from seizing indispensable household vessels, but no one can quite agree how faithfully such restraint was observed. Bedding carried similar value. Poor families slept upon straw mattresses laid on simple frames or directly above floors covered with rushes. Wool blankets were repaired repeatedly and shared during winter. If a collector removed the best covering, the loss was felt each night when wind entered through gaps in wattle walls and frost gathered near the door. In illness, households relied upon remedies made from what could be gathered nearby. Sage, plantain, feverfew, garlic, honey, and warm ale appeared in many traditional treatments. A charm written with sacred words might be worn at the neck, while a thread measured around a saint's shrine could be kept beside the sickbed. Whether these beliefs offered healing is uncertain, but they gave shape to suffering when practical help was scarce. Parish charity offered limited relief. Churches distributed alms, monasteries fed some travellers and poor people at their gates, and wealthy households sometimes gave bread on feast days or after funerals. The remains of a lord's table might be passed to servants and beggars, yet charity was irregular. It could ease hunger for a day without restoring a seized animal or paying a growing debt. Tax collectors sometimes used poverty as evidence of deceit. If the assessed sum seemed reasonable on parchment, an empty cottage might suggest hidden goods rather than genuine hardship. Officers searched lofts, barns, and neighbouring sheds. Grain concealed for survival looked identical to grain concealed for fraud. The motive mattered to the family, but not always to the account. Neighbours could intervene. Families shared ploughs, watched animals, exchanged labour, and carried food to those in trouble. One household might lend a hen another a sack of oats, and another a few pennies. These acts prevented disaster from spreading too quickly. There were limits to communal help. In a year of widespread scarcity, every cupboard was thin. After weeks of rain, the same blight could damage fields across the manor. When many households owed taxes at once, generosity became dangerous. A person who lent seed grain might be unable to sow his own land. As dusk approached, the village revealed little of these calculations. Smoke drifted above thatched roofs. A woman carried water from the well. Someone split damp wood beside a doorway, and cattle settled into their byres. The church bell sounded through mist, slow and familiar, while a collector's horse moved along the road toward the next settlement. Inside one cottage, a family sat close to the hearth. Their pottage contained more water than peas, and the place where the iron pot had hung was empty. A borrowed vessel rested on the embers instead. No dramatic cry marked the loss. Poverty usually entered quietly through smaller meals, colder nights, postponed repairs and favours that would one day have to be returned. The darkest truth was not that every collector enjoyed cruelty. Most probably did not. It was that the system could produce suffering without requiring a cruel person at every step. Each official followed a role, delivered a sum, or protected his own position. The burden descended through the chain until it reached someone with nowhere else to pass it, and there, beneath soot-dark rafters, the demand finally stopped. For those who could not pass the burden onward, survival sometimes depended upon making property disappear before the collector returned. News travelled quickly through a medieval village. A shepherd on the hillside might see mounted officials approaching along the road and send a boy toward the cottages. A miller could hear at market that the sheriff's men had already entered the neighbouring parish. By the time the collectors crossed the bridge, doors were closed, animals had been moved, and the most valuable objects were no longer where the household usually kept them. This was not always organised resistance. Often it was a series of small decisions made by frightened families. A bronze pot was carried to a sister's cottage. A length of wool was placed beneath damp hay. Coins were wrapped in cloth and pushed into a crack behind a roof beam. Grain was poured into unmarked sacks and stored in the loft of someone whose name did not appear on the assessment roll. The medieval house offered many hiding places. Walls of timber and wattle contained gaps beneath layers of clay and lime. Earthen floors could be lifted and repaired. Chests sometimes possessed concealed compartments, though such furniture was more common among prosperous households. A clay jar buried beneath the hearth might hold coins, jewellery, or a small silver buckle for years. Archaeologists have uncovered hoards of medieval coins hidden inside walls, beneath floors, and near field boundaries. Some were probably concealed during war or unrest, while others may have represented household savings protected from thieves or officials. No one can quite agree why so many owners never returned for them. Illness, death, displacement, or forgotten landmarks may have left the silver, waiting long after the original danger passed. Livestock was more difficult to hide. A pig objected loudly to being moved, and cattle left tracks in soft ground. Yet families drove animals into woodland clearings, remote pastures, or the yards of relatives. Sheep could be mixed with another flock, their ownership suddenly uncertain beneath identical wool and mud. Common grazing customs made concealment easier. Animals belonging to many households wandered together under the care of a single herder. A collector attempting to identify one family's sheep might depend upon ear cuts, coloured marks, or local testimony. Such signs could be altered, misunderstood, or conveniently overlooked. Forests offered shelter but carried dangers of their own. Much woodland belonged to a lord or crown, and forest law restricted hunting, woodcutting, and grazing. A family hiding a cow among the trees might avoid a tax collector, only to encounter a forester demanding another fine. Wolves remained present in some regions during parts of the medieval period, while thieves and desperate wanderers posed more ordinary threats. Barns belonging to churches and monasteries could appear safer. Sacred places commanded respect, and officials sometimes hesitated to conduct aggressive searches near altars, relics, or burial grounds. A desperate debtor might bring goods onto churchland or seek the priest's protection, hoping that religious authority would delay secular enforcement. The idea of sanctuary was deeply rooted in medieval society. A person accused of serious wrongdoing could, under certain customs, seek refuge inside a church for a limited period. The exact rules varied by region and century, and historians continue to debate how reliably sanctuary protected those pursued for debt rather than crime. Still, the threshold of a consecrated building carried symbolic weight. A debtor might cling to an altar, sit beside a saint's shrine, or remain within the churchyard while relatives negotiated outside. Collectors faced an uncomfortable choice. Dragging someone from holy ground could provoke the priest, bishop, and community. Waiting cost time and money. In many cases, the delay itself created room for compromise. Church doors were often heavy oak, strengthened with iron straps darkened by age. Inside, the air smelled of waxed damp stone incense and old rushes. Painted saints watched from walls lit by narrow windows. A person sheltering there might spend hours beneath a borrowed wool cloak, listening to rain strike the roof and footsteps pause beyond the door. Sanctuary did not erase a tax debt. Once the person emerged, the account remained. Yet sacred space slowed the machinery of collection and reminded officials that worldly authority existed beside another power. A collector could carry a royal seal, but the priest carried keys to the church and responsibility for the souls of the parish. Those unable to reach formal sanctuary sometimes sought less official protection. Medieval households lived in a world crowded with saints, spirits, omens, and invisible dangers. Charms were used against sickness, fire theft storms, and hostile intentions. A collector's arrival could therefore inspire remedies that blended Christian prayer with older folk practice. A small parchment bearing sacred words might be folded and sewn into clothing. The names of the Magi Caspar, Melchior, and Balthazar were sometimes written above doors as protection for travellers and households. Crosses could be marked in chalk upon chests, while sprigs of blessed herbs were kept near windows or hearths. Some villagers placed faith in objects touched to saints' relics. A strip of cloth carried home from a shrine might be wrapped around a purse or grain measure. Pilgrim badges were kept long after the journey ended and sometimes buried with their owners. Whether people believed such objects could directly turn away collectors is uncertain, but they could provide courage when lawful protection seemed absent. Rowan elder and hawthorn carried protective associations in parts of medieval Europe, although beliefs varied greatly. Branches might be placed near doors or animal shelters. Iron objects, including horseshoes, were sometimes treated as defences against harmful forces. A household might hang one above an entrance while also trusting the much more practical strength of the wooden bar across the door. Collectors generally did not retreat because of herbs or symbols, yet they belonged to the same culture and shared many of its fears. An official might mock a charm in daylight but hesitate to disturb a shrine after dark. Stories circulated about men who stole church offerings and later suffered illness, madness, or sudden death. Such tales protected sacred property where walls and locks could not. Villagers also used rumour as a shield. Someone might claim that a household was under quarantine because of fever, that an animal had died of a contagious disease, or that a corpse lay inside awaiting burial. The fear of plague or livestock sickness could make even determined officials cautious. False claims were risky, especially if discovered, but desperation narrowed the distance between cleverness and danger. The collector had methods of his own. He questioned neighbours, examined fresh tracks, searched lofts, and watched for smoke rising from supposedly empty cottages. He could place guards near roads and markets, knowing that hidden goods eventually had to be sold or used. A concealed pig still required feeding. Buried grain could not remain beneath the floor forever. Informers were especially useful. A neighbour with an old grievance might reveal where livestock had been driven. A servant could describe coins hidden inside bedding. In return, the informer might receive a share of recovered goods relief from a fine or simple satisfaction. Communities depended upon cooperation, but closeness also made secrecy fragile. Anyone discovered concealing taxable goods faced additional penalties. The property could be seized, the original debt restored, and a fine added for deception. A person who had sworn falsely before jurors risked public shame and spiritual condemnation. Priests preached that perjury endangered the soul, particularly when an oath had been made upon the Gospels or relics. Even so, concealment continued because the alternative could be hunger. A family hiding seed grain did not necessarily think of itself as defying the king. It might believe it was protecting next year's bread. Law saw withheld property. The household saw the difference between sowing and starvation. Night eventually covered the evidence. Mist gathered among the hedges and watchfires glowed faintly near a distant manor. In the sleeping village, hidden coins rested beneath clay floors. A cow stood quietly in a woodland enclosure. Grain waited behind the wall of a neighbour's loft while a charm of parchment and thread hung above an oak door. The collectors would return and some secrets would be discovered. Others would remain hidden until danger passed. A few would remain concealed for centuries, outlasting the household, the ledger, and the ruler whose seal had first sent officials down the muddy road. The coin sacks, animals, and promises gathered from villages did not remain in the collector's hands forever. They moved onward slowly and unevenly toward manor houses, abbeys, fortified towns, and royal treasuries. Along the way, some portion was lost to wages, transport, spoilage, corruption, and simple confusion. What survived was drawn into the ambitions of rulers who might never see the cottages from which it came. Revenue travelled with difficulty. Silver could be packed into wooden chests reinforced with iron bands and carried by cart or pack horse. Armed servants accompanied valuable loads along roads where mud slowed wheels, and woodland offered cover to robbers. The journey was often planned around daylight bridges and secure lodging. At night, the chest might be placed beside the bed of an official or locked within a monastery storehouse. Grain required far more space. It could be sent to a castle granary, sold at a market, or used to feed soldiers, servants, builders, and horses. Livestock might be driven toward a lord's estate and converted into meat, hides, wool, or coin. Payments collected in many different forms were gradually transformed into resources that authority could use. The destination was sometimes a castle rising above the countryside. Castles were not built from stone alone. Their walls represented thousands of days spent quarrying, cutting, hauling, lifting, and shaping. Lime had to be burned for mortar. Timber was required for scaffolding roofs, gates, floors, siege engines, and countless smaller structures. Ironworkers forged hinges, nails, chains, locks, and tools. Carters transported supplies along roads already worn by harvest wagons and tax convoys. A peasant surrendering a few pennies might never know which mason later received them as wages, yet the connection existed. Small payments gathered across hundreds of households became the money that kept builders beside the wall, supplied bread to labourers, and replaced ropes frayed by heavy lifting. Some work was performed through compulsory labour rather than wages. Lords could summon tenants to repair ditches, carry timber, strengthen embankments, or maintain roads leading to fortified sites. The exact burden varied widely, and no one can quite agree how regularly such duties were demanded outside moments of danger. In some places, labour service was an old custom. In others, rulers hired skilled workers because forced labour was too slow or unreliable. The castle consumed resources even after construction ended. Roofs leaked, wooden palisades rotted, wells required cleaning, gate mechanisms needed repair, and stone cracked beneath frost. Guards expected wages or provisions. Horses ate oats and hay each day, whether enemies appeared or not. Inside the walls, the household created further expense. Great halls had to be heated, though fireplaces rarely warmed their distant corners. Kitchens required firewood, charcoal, salt, spices, grain, fish, meat, and ale. Servants carried water, swept old rushes from floors, cleaned trenchers, polished metal vessels, and prepared chambers for guests. Fresh rushes were sometimes mixed with sweet-smelling herbs such as lavender, mint, or meadowsweet before being scattered across a hall floor. The practice softened footsteps and helped disguise less pleasant odours, although historians continued to debate how frequently the rushes were changed in different households. Even this small comfort required cutting, gathering, drying, transporting, and labour. Royal households were larger worlds of consumption. Kings travelled between estates because one residence could not always support the court indefinitely. Hundreds of people might accompany the ruler: nobles, clerks, chaplains, cooks, grooms, guards, musicians, laundresses, servants, and petitioners. Their arrival transformed a quiet manor into a crowded centre of government. Food disappeared rapidly. Bakers worked before dawn. Ale was brewed in quantity. Oxen, pigs, sheep, poultry, smoked fish. and barrels of salted provisions passed through storerooms. Beeswax candles illuminated chapels and private chambers, while cheaper tallow candles and rushlights served less prestigious spaces. Ceremony also demanded money. A ruler's authority was not maintained only by soldiers and laws. It had to be displayed through clothing feasts, banners, processions, gifts, tournaments, coronations, funerals, and religious observance. Cloth of rich colour, embroidered hangings, silver vessels, and fur-lined robes communicated rank to everyone who entered the hall. Gift-giving formed an important part of political life. Kings rewarded loyal followers with land offices, jewellery, horses, robes, or money. Visiting ambassadors received hospitality suited to their status. At New Year and other ceremonial moments, gifts circulated through courts, strengthening relationships and revealing hierarchy. A ruler who appeared ungenerous risked weakening the loyalty upon which his government depended. The common pennies collected in distant villages therefore helped support not only practical administration but the theatre of power. A jewelled clasp worn during a feast, a canopy carried above a royal procession, or a candle burning before a saint's relic could all be connected through many exchanges to taxes gathered far away. War consumed even more. Armies required food before they required battle. Grain had to be ground and baked. Salted meat was packed into carts. Horses needed fodder, shoes, saddles, and replacement tack. Archers carried bows that required seasoned wood strings, arrows, and iron heads. Men-at-arms expected wages, while ships needed timber rope sails, crews, and provisions. Some military service was owed through feudal duty, but rulers increasingly depended upon paid troops and contracts, particularly during prolonged campaigns. A knight summoned for a limited period could return home when his obligation ended. A paid soldier remained only while money or the promise of money continued. Taxes were therefore announced in the language of defence and necessity. Officials claimed that levies protected roads, borders, churches, homes, and the peace of the realm. Sometimes this was true. Raiders could burn villages, destroy harvests, and empty monasteries. Fortified walls and organised armies offered real protection. At other times, taxes funded distant campaigns driven by inheritance claims, dynastic rivalry, prestige, or a ruler's desire for territory. The villagers who surrendered grain might know little of the quarrel. They heard unfamiliar place names spoken at market and saw wounded men returning months later along pilgrimage roads. Some chroniclers praised rulers who taxed heavily to defend Christendom or restore lawful lands. Others condemned kings who exhausted their people for pride. Those who wrote these accounts served different patrons and viewed the same campaign through different loyalties, leaving motives as uncertain as the figures in many tax rolls. Administration itself required revenue. Clerks had to be trained, housed, and paid. Messengers needed horses. Judges travelled between towns. Seals, parchment, wax, ink, and storage chests were purchased. Castles held archives where documents accumulated in cupboards and chambers protected from damp, fire, and mice. Royal government became more capable as these written systems expanded. It could remember debts across years, send instructions farther, and demand increasingly detailed accounts. The same pennies that supported walls and soldiers also strengthened the machinery that would return to collect more pennies later. By evening, the castle above the valley glowed with scattered points of fire. Torches burned near the gate. Candlelight showed through narrow windows and smoke drifted from kitchen roofs. Somewhere inside, clerks compared accounts, while servants carried trenchers toward the hall. Far below, the village settled beneath darkness. Doors were barred, animals fed, and wool blankets pulled close against the cold. The castle appeared distant and almost timeless upon its hill, its stone towers silvered by moonlight. Yet hidden inside those walls were fragments of countless humble lives, the hen taken from one cottage, the oats measured in another yard, the toll paid beside a bridge, and the penny saved through winter, only to vanish into a collector's pouch. The castle stood because stone held stone, but it also stood because ordinary hands scattered across the sleeping countryside had paid for it. The castle might stand upon common pennies, but common people were not always willing to surrender them quietly. Resistance rarely began with raised weapons. More often it appeared as delay, confusion, silence, or the sudden inability of an entire village to remember what an official wished to know. A collector could arrive with seals clerks and armed servants, only to discover that cattle had wandered, grain measures had gone missing, and the men responsible for answering questions were attending a distant funeral. Such behaviour was difficult to punish because each excuse seemed possible. Medieval life was genuinely uncertain. Animals escaped through broken hedges, roads flooded, illness confined people to bed, feast days interrupted work, and church obligations drew villagers away from their homes. The same conditions that made taxation difficult also offered shelter for resistance. False declarations were among the simplest methods. A household understated its harvest, denied ownership of livestock, or claimed that valuable goods belonged to relatives. A merchant declared fewer bundles at the gate than he actually carried. An alewife insisted that the drink in her vats was intended only for her family and not for sale. Local jurors could support these claims, because assessments often depended upon the testimony of neighbours. The village possessed a limited ability to protect itself. Men called before the steward might swear that a tenant held less land than the official suspected, or that a widow's cow belonged to her married daughter. Such statements blurred the boundary between communal mercy and perjury. No one can quite agree how often entire communities cooperated in deception. Official records naturally preserve cases that were discovered, not those that succeeded. Yet repeated orders against concealment and false assessment suggest that authorities encountered the problem often enough to fear it. Silence could be equally effective. Officials arriving in an unfamiliar settlement depended upon local guides. Without them, field boundaries became unclear, family relationships tangled, and ownership difficult to prove. A collector might point toward a flock grazing beyond the stream and ask whose sheep they were. Several villagers could look toward the animals and offer no certain answer. The quiet unity of such moments was fragile. One frightened person could reveal everything. A rival family might speak truthfully out of resentment, or an ambitious reeve might cooperate in hope of favour. Still, villagers understood that today's target could be tomorrow's ally. Mutual protection often rested less upon affection than upon shared vulnerability. Delay became another weapon. A community asked for a new assessment, claimed that proper notice had not been given, or demanded that an ancient charter be examined. A clerk was told that the local chest containing the records could not be opened because the key holder was away. A priest requested postponement until after a funeral or feast. Every delay cost the collector food, lodging, wages, and patience. Horses consumed oats while officials waited. Parchment absorbed damp air. Armed servants became restless beside the manor fire. A collector responsible for several villages might accept reduced payment simply to continue his journey before winter roads worsened. Some people chose flight instead. A tenant unable to meet obligations could leave the manor and seek work in a town on another estate, or among seasonal labourers moving between harvests. Towns offered anonymity, especially where crowds gathered for fairs and markets. A person who remained beyond the reach of a lord for a recognized period might, under certain customs, gain greater freedom. Flight carried severe risks. The fugitive abandoned land family support tools and the protection of familiar neighbours. Roads were dangerous and towns did not promise work. A runaway could be recognized by a traveler arrested by local officers or forced into begging. Historians continue to debate how easily peasants escaped the obligations of their birthplace for law, and practice differed widely. Those who stayed sometimes refused collectively. A village might agree not to pay until an assessment was lowered or an abusive officer removed. Such resistance required unusual discipline. The wealthier tenants often feared confiscation, while the poorest had little left to lose. If a few households submitted, the unity of the rest weakened. Collective refusal was sometimes expressed through the manor court. Jurors declined to present offenders, challenged the steward's reading of custom, or insisted that a new payment had never been owed before. Medieval people were deeply aware of custom not as vague tradition but as a form of law. A demand considered ancient could be accepted reluctantly. A demand considered new invited suspicion. Villagers might claim that their fathers and grandfathers had never paid the fee. The steward answered that the obligation appeared in an old roll. The argument turned upon memory, parchment, and authority. A faded document could defeat living testimony, but sometimes a determined community forced negotiation. Marketplaces offered more public forms of protest. Traders complained about tolls, refused to use official stalls, or shifted business to a neighbouring town. If too many merchants stayed away, the market lord lost revenue. Town authorities therefore had reason to moderate collectors who drove commerce elsewhere. A boycott was rarely announced formally. It appeared as an unusually empty square, fewer carts at the gate, and grain sold along roadside crossings beyond official control. Collectors responded by watching alternative paths, finding illegal traders and claiming jurisdiction over nearby gathering places. Occasionally resistance became louder. A tax officer might be surrounded by villagers demanding the return of seized goods. A cart carrying grain could be blocked in a narrow lane. Bells rang unexpectedly, summoning people not for worship but alarm. Women whose household stores had been taken sometimes appeared prominently in such confrontations because they understood exactly what the missing grain meant for winter meals. The weapons at hand were ordinary tools, staffs, flails, axes, pitchforks, stones, and knives. Their presence did not always lead to violence. A large crowd could force a collector to withdraw without a blow. The officer knew that injured villagers produced little revenue, and villagers knew that attacking a royal servant could bring severe punishment. When violence did occur, it was often brief and confused. A servant was struck, a ledger was torn or burned. A money chest disappeared during the commotion. Horses bolted, carrying saddlebags into the road. Later accounts described the event as rebellion, robbery, riot, or defense, depending upon who had written them. Destroying records held special meaning. The parchment roll preserved debts, services, fines, and names. Burning it seemed to erase the past and release the village from obligations. Yet copies might exist elsewhere, and officials could reconstruct accounts through testimony. Still, the image of a ledger curling in fire carried powerful hope. Some communities attacked symbols rather than people. Toll barriers were pulled down, official measuring vessels were broken. A collector's staff was taken and thrown into a ditch. These acts announced that the authority represented by the object had been rejected, at least for the moment. Punishment could follow swiftly. Sheriffs summoned armed men. Suspected leaders were arrested, fined, imprisoned, or forced to provide guarantees of future obedience. Entire villages could face collective penalties. A community that had resisted one payment might owe far more after royal officers restored order. Yet punishment also required care. Authorities could not imprison every tenant or seize every plough. Lords depended upon villages to produce food, rent, and labour. After displays of forced, negotiations often resumed. Assessments were reduced, payment schedules extended, or unpopular collectors quietly replaced. As night returned, the field where a crowd had gathered became empty again. A broken barrier lay beside the road. Mud covered the marks of many feet, and a torn strip of parchment clung to a thorn hedge. Far away, bells sounded from an abbey, steady and indifferent to the arguments of the day. Inside cottages, people spoke in low voices. Some felt relief that the collector had gone. Others feared his return with soldiers. A staff rested near the door, not as a weapon perhaps, but within easy reach. Resistance in the medieval world rarely ended taxation. It altered its pace, exposed its limits, and reminded officials that authority weakened when too many people stopped believing obedience was possible. The villagers still lived beneath castle walls, church bells, and written demands. But for a brief moment in the muddy road, the machinery had paused because ordinary people had refused to move with it. When resistance spread beyond a single lane or market square, the collector's position could change with unsettling speed. A man who had entered a village surrounded by servants and carrying a royal seal might leave it without his horse, without his account roll, and without any certainty that the next bridge remained safe. Public anger rarely appeared without warning. It gathered through repeated visits, disputed assessments, seized animals, and promises of relief that never arrived. Villagers compared experiences at Wells Church, porches, mills, and autumn fairs. Merchants carried stories from one town to another. Pilgrims heard complaints while sharing straw beds in monastic guest houses and repeated them farther along the road. The collector became more than an individual. He became the nearest visible face of demands created elsewhere. The king remained distant behind castle walls, and the lord might spend much of the year on another estate. The man who opened the ledger, rejected the coin, or ordered the seizure stood within reach. Some officials understood this danger and avoided unnecessary display. They travelled early, kept their armed companions close, and lodged inside fortified manor houses. Others behaved as though the seal protected them everywhere. They demanded the finest rooms, consumed expensive food, and spoke harshly to people whose names they barely knew. Such conduct gave anger a voice and a target. Rumours magnified every offence. A collector accused of taking an extra hen in one village might be said to have emptied an entire poultry yard by the time the story reached the next market. A clerk who refused a damaged penny became a man who rejected all poor people's money. No one can quite agree how much truth lay beneath every surviving accusation, but rumours mattered because people acted upon what they believed officials capable of doing. During wider unrest, bells became instruments of alarm. A church bell rung at an unusual hour could summon villagers from fields and workshops. The sound travelled over hedges, marshes, and winter pasture, reaching settlements beyond sight of one another. Medieval bells did not merely mark sacred time. They could warn of fire raiders, violent quarrels, and approaching officers. A collector hearing hurried bells behind him might urge his horse toward the nearest town. Mud made speed difficult. Pack animals carrying coin or parchment moved slowly, and carts could become trapped in deep ruts. Roads that had allowed royal authority to enter the countryside could just as easily prevent it from escaping. Tollkeepers sometimes abandoned their post when crowds approached. Manor servants hid staffs and badges. Local reeves claimed illness or disappeared into woods until tempers cooled. Because much administration depended upon local cooperation, official power could collapse before any castle gate had been forced. An armed collector remained dangerous, but his escort was usually small. Several servants could intimidate an isolated household. They could not easily control hundreds of angry tenants carrying axes, flails, bows, and heavy staffs. The crowd did not need formal military training. It knew the streams, holloways, field gates, and forest tracks better than the strangers it pursued. Officials tried to remove the most valuable objects first. Coin chests were sent ahead under guard. Rolls were folded into leather cases and tied beneath cloaks. Seals were concealed, for losing a seal could allow others to issue false commands. Clerks sometimes destroyed temporary notes rather than let them fall into hostile hands. Records describe collectors being dragged from horses, beaten, imprisoned in village buildings, or forced to swear that they would never return. Some were made to surrender money already collected. Others had their clothing torn away as a form of humiliation. Medieval society placed great importance upon visible rank, and stripping an official of his fur-lined cloak belt staff or badge symbolically removed his authority. The destruction of a collector's insignia could matter as much as injury to his body. A staff was broken before witnesses. A wax seal was crushed beneath a boot. A parchment commission was torn into strips and scattered across the market square. The crowd declared through these acts that the distant ruler's command no longer governed that place. Yet crowds were not always united about how far to go. Some wanted only the return of seized goods. Others demanded that records be burned. A few wished to punish officials personally. Priests, elders, and prosperous tenants sometimes stepped between angry villagers and captured collectors, fearing that murder would bring soldiers and collective retaliation. A priest might lead the official into the church, reversing the usual pattern of sanctuary. The same stone walls that sheltered debtors could now protect the collector from those he had taxed. Inside, beneath painted saints and smoking candles, he waited while negotiations took place in the churchyard. This protection was uncertain. Sacred space commanded respect, but fury could overcome restraint. Chroniclers sometimes portrayed crowds violating churches as proof of wickedness, while other accounts emphasized that clergy successfully prevented bloodshed. Those who recorded the events rarely agreed, because each writer wished to explain who had possessed justice. Unpopular clerks faced special danger because they preserved the knowledge upon which collection depended. A collector might be replaced, but a clerk who knew names, boundaries, arrears, and exemptions represented continuity. Crowds searched for account chests and compelled clerks to reveal where copies were stored. A lesser-known form of punishment involved forcing an official to eat or symbolically swallow pieces of his own records. Such stories may have been exaggerated by later tellers, and historians debate how literally they should be understood. Yet the image reflected a powerful desire. The man who had fed upon the village's wealth would be made to consume the parchment that justified it. More commonly, rolls were burned. In a manor yard or market square, dry parchment resisted flame, at first curling and blackening near the edges. Wax seals melted. Ink darkened before vanishing into ash. Villagers watched names and debts disappear in the firelight, though the obligations themselves were not always so easily destroyed. The collector who escaped carried news toward the castle. Gates closed behind him. Watchmen were doubled, and messengers rode to neighbouring lords or royal officers. Inside candlelit chambers, frightened clerks attempted to reconstruct what had happened. Reports often described the crowd as lawless, even when its demands had begun with the dispute over lawful custom. Retaliation could follow. Armed retainers entered villages, arrested suspected leaders, and seized property. Gallows near roads reminded travellers of royal justice. Fines were imposed upon communities unable or unwilling to surrender individuals. A manor might be required to provide hostages or guarantees that future collectors would not be harmed. Still, authority beyond the walls remained fragile. Soldiers could punish a village and then depart. Collectors still needed local people to identify households, guide them through fields, and explain old customs. Fear restored obedience for a time, but it rarely restored trust. Some officials altered their methods after unrest. They arrived with fewer demands, offered clearer explanations, or accepted collective payments through respected villagers. Others increased their escorts and became harsher, interpreting restraint as weakness. Both approaches reveal the same truth: the seal alone had never been enough. Late at night, watchfires burned along the castle wall while sentries listened for movement below. Beyond the boat, the countryside seemed peaceful. Moonlight rested upon empty fields, and distant cottages showed only faint lines of smoke. Yet somewhere along the dark road a broken staff lay in the mud, and a collector's torn parchment moved softly in the wind. For a brief and dangerous time, the man who had carried fear from household to household had learned to fear the households together. Authority had not vanished completely, but beyond the light of the castle gate, it had become uncertain, negotiable, and mortal. After the roads had quieted and the broken toll barriers had been raised again, rulers faced an uncomfortable question. If collectors had provoked disorder, who was truly to blame? The villagers, who resisted the officials who abused their authority, or the government that demanded more than the countryside could safely provide? The answer was rarely simple, and it was almost never admitted openly. Kings depended upon taxation, but they also depended upon the belief that their justice was different from mere force. A ruler who appeared unable to control his own servants risked losing respect, yet a ruler who punished every collector accused by a village might weaken the very machinery that supplied castles, armies, courts, and households. Investigations therefore began cautiously. A royal commission might arrive in a county carrying sealed instructions to hear complaints, inspect accounts, and question witnesses. The commissioners could include judges, clerks, knights, churchmen, or trusted servants of the crown. They lodged in castles, abbeys, or prosperous manor houses where servants prepared chambers with straw mattresses, wool blankets, wash basins, and candles. Their arrival created a different kind of anxiety. The tax collector who had once questioned villagers now waited to be questioned himself. Account rolls were removed from chests, tally sticks were fitted together, seals were examined for damage, and clerks searched for crossed-out figures or unexplained additions. Witnesses were summoned from nearby settlements. Reeves priests, merchants, widows, millers, and tenants stood before the commission and described what had happened. Some spoke of unauthorized fees, others claimed that animals had been seized after debts were paid, that grain had been measured unfairly, or that collectors had demanded expensive meals and lodging. Testimony was often given under oath. A witness might place a hand upon the Gospels or swear before a relic. Such an oath carried spiritual danger as well as legal consequence. Perjury was believed to threaten the soul, and stories circulated about liars struck by illness or sudden misfortune after swearing falsely upon holy objects. Yet fear did not guarantee truth. A villager might exaggerate an official's cruelty in hope of compensation. A collector's servants could support his account out of loyalty or self-protection. A local lord might accuse a royal officer to defend his own privileges. No one can quite agree how effectively commissions separated genuine abuse from rivalry and rumour. Written accounts were supposed to provide certainty, but they often raised new questions. A roll might show that a payment had been received, while the household claimed that twice the amount had been taken. A collector could argue that the extra goods covered transport costs or old arrears. The clerk who'd written the entry might be dead absent or conveniently unable to remember. Royal investigators examined lifestyles as well as figures. An official who had recently purchased land, built a new chamber, or dressed his household in unusually fine cloth could attract suspicion. Wealth gained too quickly suggested that revenue had been diverted before reaching the treasury. The collector defended himself by listing legitimate expenses. Horses required oats and shoes, armed escorts expected wages, messengers needed food and lodging. Coin had to be transported through dangerous country while grain spoiled and livestock died. What looked like stolen wealth might be explained as repayment for years of difficult service. Some explanations were accepted, others were not. An official found guilty could be fined, dismissed, imprisoned, or ordered to repay what he had taken. property might be seized from his home. Chests were opened, silver vessels inventoried, and livestock driven away under the same authority he had once exercised over others. Public punishment served a useful purpose. A collector might be placed in the pillory where townspeople could see that royal justice had acted. His staff of office could be broken, and his name announced in the market square. In more serious cases involving forgery, theft from the crown, or violence, imprisonment could be prolonged and the penalties severe. Still, punishment tended to fall most easily upon lesser officials. A local beadle or clerk possessed fewer powerful friends than a sheriff related to noble families. A bailiff could be blamed for harsh collection, even when he had acted under pressure from a steward. Those closest to the village often carried both the orders and the consequences. Some rulers attempted reform rather than punishment alone. They issued new instructions limiting what collectors could demand for food, lodging, or travel. Officials were forbidden to seize essential tools, seed grain bedding, or draft animals in certain circumstances. Standard measures were ordered for grain, and written receipts were required after payment. Receipts offered important protection, though only when the payer could preserve them. A strip of parchment marked with a seal or a matching tally stick could prove that a debt had been settled. Villagers were advised to keep such evidence in chests away from damp and fire. In cottages where smoke blackened the rafters and rain entered through the thatch, this was easier said than done. Other reforms changed the method of assessment. Instead of allowing one official to estimate a household's wealth, groups of local jurors were asked to swear collectively to the value of property. The hope was that shared responsibility would reduce corruption. Yet local juries brought their own loyalties, grudges, and private arrangements. Governments also experimented with fixed collective sums. A village or town might be told to produce a total amount and decide internally how to divide it. This spared royal officers from entering every household. It also transferred conflict into the community, where prosperous tenants and poor labourers argued over who should bear the greater share. Councils promised that taxes would be levied only with proper consent. Nobles, clergy, and representatives of towns sometimes negotiated with rulers over extraordinary demands. Such assemblies could limit royal action, at least in theory, by insisting that taxation required discussion and justification. The language of fairness became increasingly important. Proclamations condemned extortion and promised that loyal subjects would not be oppressed. Collectors were ordered to take only what was lawfully due. Judges were told to hear complaints without favour, and sheriffs were reminded that their office served the king's peace rather than private profit. These promises were read aloud in market squares, manor courts, and churchyards. Many listeners could not read the parchment themselves, but they heard the familiar phrases of protection and lawful custom. For a moment it may have seemed that distant authority had recognized their suffering. Yet reform had limits. The king still needed revenue. Wars continued, walls required repair, and royal households consumed food, cloth, horses, candles, and coin. A fairer assessment could still be unaffordable after a failed harvest. An honest collector could still remove the last useful animal if the law allowed it. The deeper inequality remained untouched. Great lords negotiated exemptions. Monasteries produced ancient charters. Wealthy towns purchased privileges. Poor households relied upon mercy sureties, borrowed coin, or the uncertain willingness of neighbours to defend them. Even well-designed rules depended upon enforcement. A prohibition against excessive hospitality meant little if no one dared accuse the visiting sheriff. A protected cooking pot could still disappear when officers claimed that another vessel remained. A receipt could be ignored by a corrupt clerk who insisted it applied to a different debt. As evening settled over the commission's final day, the hall grew quiet. Witnesses departed along wet roads, pulling cloaks close against the wind. Clerks tied the completed rolls with cord and pressed wax seals beneath folded parchment. A servant scattered fresh rushes across the floor before extinguishing the cheaper tallow lights. Beyond the windows, mist gathered around the manor walls. The church bell sounded the hour slow and deep while cartwheels faded toward the village. A few collectors had been punished. Several assessments had been revised. New promises of justice would soon travel outward beneath royal seals. But in cottages beneath the dark fields, families still counted grain-guarded animals and wondered when the next demand would arrive. Reform had made the machinery quieter and perhaps less cruel in certain hands. It had not stopped the machinery from turning. The new promises travelled outward along the same roads that had carried the old demands. They passed beneath castle gates, through abbey courtyards, across bridges darkened by rain, and into villages where people had learned to receive official words with patience rather than trust. A proclamation could declare that collectors must behave justly. A sealed order could forbid unlawful seizure. Yet parchment moved more quickly than change. In some places, the next officer arrived with gentler instructions and accepted a delayed payment without humiliation. Elsewhere, the same habits continued beneath different names, as though the machinery had learned to cover its sharpest edges without becoming less hungry. The medieval tax collector therefore remained a figure of uncertainty. He could be a corrupt stranger, a tired clerk, a frightened local reeve, or a minor servant struggling to satisfy an impossible account. He might take pleasure in authority or dread every household he was required to visit. The records rarely preserve the private thoughts of such men. They preserve payments, arrears, fines, complaints and punishments, but not the long silence after an ox was led away. No one can quite agree how ordinary villagers remembered individual collectors after they had gone. Some names became curses in local stories. Others may have been forgotten, almost immediately replaced by the next official, the next harvest and the next winter. A fair collector left fewer traces than a cruel one, for mercy seldom produced a lawsuit or a chronicler's angry sentence. The ledgers, however, remained. They rested in wooden chests within castles, monasteries, guild halls and royal offices. Leather covers stiffened. Wax seals cracked. Dust settled upon rolls tied with faded cords. Mice found the corners of neglected parchments, while damp air blurred ink in rooms where shutters no longer closed properly. Each narrow line held the shadow of a household. A name, a few acres, 2 sheep, a debt carried forward, a payment of oats, or a note that the tenant had died. The warmth of the cottage, the smell of pottage, the sound of rain on thatch, and the quiet worry around the hearth did not enter the account. Yet those missing things were the true cost. Taxation changed the way people measured time. The year was not only spring sowing, summer haymaking, autumn harvest, and winter rest. It was also the season when rent fell due, the feast by which arrears had to be cleared, the market day when grain could be sold for coin, and the morning when officials might appear along the lane. Families planned around these dates. A hen was kept alive because it would be owed at Christmas. Wool was stored for a payment expected after shearing. A few pennies were hidden beneath cloth in a chest untouched even when salt ran low. Survival required not merely producing enough, but anticipating what others would claim. The collector altered relationships within the village as well. Neighbours became sureties, witnesses, informers, protectors and rivals. One household concealed another's grain. A prosperous farmer lent coin to a struggling tenant. A reeve softened an assessment for a cousin and enforced it strictly against an enemy. Authority entered the community and used its oldest friendships and quarrels. Even the church stood within this web. Its bells summoned villagers to prayer and taxation alike. Its walls sheltered frightened debtors and endangered officials. Its priests preached obedience, mercy, justice, and the danger of dishonest oaths, though these teachings could pull in different directions. A saint's image watched while a widow pleaded for delay. Beeswax candles burned above the altar while grain was counted in a nearby tithe barn. Pilgrims passed through churchyards carrying badges from distant shrines, paying tolls along roads built partly through the very levies they resented. The medieval world was filled with such contradictions. Taxes could fund walls that protected villages from raiders, yet the collection could leave those villages hungry. They could maintain bridges used by merchants and pilgrims, while tolls discouraged the poorest from crossing. They could support courts that punished corrupt officials, while those same courts depended upon the revenue officials gathered. The darkness of the system did not lie only in theft or violence. It lay in the distance between purpose and consequence. A ruler saw an army supplied, a castle repaired, or a debt paid. A household saw an empty grain bin, a missing blanket, and an unploughed strip. Between them stood the collector, carrying the command downward and the payment upward. As years passed, collectors changed. Rulers died and new seals were pressed into wax. A boy who once watched officers take his family's pig grew old beneath another king. The castle roof was rebuilt. The bridge stones were replaced. The parish bell cracked and was recast its new voice, carrying across fields worked by another generation. Old debts vanished from memory, though new ones took their place. The roads remained muddy, the winters long, and the distance between the village and the royal chamber as difficult to measure as ever. Now the evening settles over that landscape. The last clerk has tied his roll and laid down his quill. The candles in the account chamber have burned low, leaving only small pools of light upon the table. Outside, the shutter's wind moves along the castle wall and passes into the sleeping countryside. Watchfires glow faintly above the gate. A sentry draws his cloak closer and listens to the distant sound of water beneath the bridge. Below him the road disappears between bare trees shining softly where the rain has gathered in old wagon ruts. Farther away an abbey rests beneath the night. The monks have finished the final office and the last responses have faded beneath the stone vaults. One lamp remains near the altar, its flame hardly moving in the still air. In the guest house, pilgrims sleep beside their staffs and folded cloaks carrying toll receipts, charms and small coins for the road ahead. Beyond the abbey villages lie quiet among winter fields. Oak doors are barred. Animals breathe behind thin walls. Embers settle beneath ash while families rest beneath patched wool blankets. A clay pot stands beside one hearth, hidden silver beneath another floor, and an old tally stick lies forgotten inside a chest. No collector rides there tonight. The manor hall is dark. The scales have been put away, the grain measures stacked, and the official table stands empty beneath soot-dark rafters. Rain taps softly upon the roof, patient and uncounted. The names once written in the ledger have long since passed from the world. Their houses returned to earth. Their fields changed hands until no one remembered the boundaries over which they had argued. Even the kings who demanded their pennies became carved figures upon tombs watched by silent saints in candlelit chapels. Yet the faint impression of those lives remains. It remains in castle walls raised by forgotten labour, in bridges worn smooth beneath generations of feet, and in parchment rolls where a few strokes of ink preserve the existence of people otherwise lost to history. Their payments were small, but their endurance was vast, and so the medieval road grows quieter now. The collector's horse has passed beyond hearing. The clerk's final candle flickers, bends, and goes dark. Mist crosses the fields, covering the ruts, the toll gate, and the path leading toward the sleeping village. Only the bells remain for a little while longer, sounding gently through the night, marking time for those who once counted every penny, and for those who carried the pennies away. Then even the bells fade, leaving the old world to its rest.